He was a parasite in a pressed shirt, the kind of man who smiled at city council meetings and kicked his tenants' doors in at midnight. His name was Fletcher Dowd, and in the town of Rivière-du-Loup, Quebec, he was considered a pillar of the community. Nobody had told the postal worker that. Lena Savoie had been delivering mail on Route 7 for 3 years. She knew every mailbox, every cracked driveway, every dog that pretended to sleep until you reached the gate. She was 26, 5'4", and had a student loan debt that kept her awake on Thursday nights. She'd applied to law school twice. She didn't talk about it anymore. People had a way of looking at her differently when she said that, the way you look at someone who thinks the jump is shorter than it is. She didn't mind the route. She minded Fletcher Dowd. He owned 14 properties on her route. 14. The buildings were not the worst she'd seen, but they were close. Peeling exterior paint, intercoms that hadn't worked since 2019, one building on Rue Cartier where the front vestibule flooded every spring, and the landlord's solution had been a handwritten sign taped to the door. Watch your step. The tenants knew better than to complain loudly. Fletcher had a lawyer. He had a cousin on the municipal housing committee. He had a way of looking at people that said, I can wait you out. Lena wasn't a tenant, but she saw what happened to the ones who pushed back. She didn't go looking for trouble on the morning of February 3rd. She was running 20 minutes behind because the sorting machine at the depot had jammed again and the temperature was sitting at -19 with wind. She pulled her truck up to 44 Rue des Pins at 8:42 in the morning, grabbed the stack of mail for the building, and started up the front walk. That's when she saw the woman. She was sitting on the bottom step of the exterior staircase, the metal one that ran up the side of the building to the second floor. Sitting, not standing. Her coat was open. She was wearing slippers. Lena stopped. Ma'am? The woman didn't look up right away. She was somewhere in her 80s, with white hair pulled back loosely and the kind of stillness that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of someone who had used up a great deal of energy getting to where they were and didn't have more to spend. Ma'am, are you okay? Woman looked up then. Her eyes were clear, but there was something behind them that was searching for something she couldn't quite find. I was looking for Charles, she said. He said he'd be here. Lena crouched down. The woman's hands were bare. The temperature display on the truck had read -19. The slippers were thin canvas, the kind you wore between the bedroom and the kitchen. How long have you been out here? The woman thought about it with a seriousness that suggested she understood the question was important. I'm not sure, she said finally. The light was different when I came out. Lena looked at the woman's hands, then at the open coat, then at the slippers. She looked up at the staircase, second floor. She looked at the intercom panel. 4 buttons, no names, 2 of them missing their labels entirely. She took off her own gloves and put them on the woman's hands. The woman looked at them with mild surprise, as if gloves had appeared from somewhere unexpected. I'm going to find someone to help you, Lena said. What's your name? Dorothy, the woman said. Dorothy Gagnon. Okay, Dorothy, I want you to stay right here. Can you do that? Dorothy nodded very seriously. Lena went to the intercom and pressed all 4 buttons in succession. Nothing. She pressed them again, holding each one down for 3 full seconds. On the 3rd button, a crackle. Yeah? I'm the mail carrier. There's an elderly woman outside on your front steps. She's not dressed for the cold. Can you come down? A pause. Is this a joke? It is not a joke. Please come down. The man who came down was in his 40s, in a bathrobe, holding coffee. He looked at Dorothy the way you look at a problem you didn't create but are now somehow responsible for. He said he didn't know her. He said he'd seen her a couple times in the hall but thought she was visiting someone. He said he didn't know which unit she was in. Lena looked at Dorothy. Dorothy was watching a pigeon on the roof. Lena called the non-emergency line. She explained the situation. The dispatcher said someone would be out within the hour. Lena looked at the temperature display again. She looked at Dorothy's canvas slippers. She said she would wait. She sat down on the step beside Dorothy and she unzipped her Canada Post parka, the big one, the one they issued in November with the reflective strips on the sleeves, and she put it around both their shoulders. Dorothy leaned into her a little. Charles used to meet me here, Dorothy said before. Was Charles your husband? 41 years, Dorothy said. She said it the way you say something that is simply true, without decoration. They sat like that for 23 minutes. Lena's supervisor called twice. She let it go to voicemail the first time and answered the second time and said she had an emergency. Her supervisor said, "You have a route to finish." She said she understood. She stayed where she was. The paramedics arrived at 9:17. By then, Dorothee's color was better. The borrowed warmth had done something. The paramedics were kind. They got her talking about Charles, and she told them about a trip to Charlevoix in 1987 and a restaurant where the fish was so good she'd cried, and by the time they had her on the stretcher, she was almost smiling. One of the paramedics gave Lena her parka back. The other said, "You probably saved her from a bad situation." He said it simply, the way people say things that are true. Lena finished her route 2 hours late. Her supervisor, a man named Bouchard who had been in the job for 22 years and had strong feelings about route completion times, filed a formal notice of delay in her personnel file. She signed the acknowledgement at 4:15 that afternoon. She drove home. She ate toast for dinner because she hadn't had time to think about groceries. She didn't think much about what she'd done on the step that morning. It had seemed at the time like the only reasonable thing to do. She found out 3 days later what it had cost her. The call came from her union representative, a soft-spoken man named Bergeron, who had the manner of someone who delivered bad news often enough that he'd developed a careful system for it. Start slow, let the person track where you're going. Fletcher Dowd had filed a complaint. Not a housing complaint. Not a noise complaint. A formal allegation against Lena Savoie, Canada Post Carrier Route 7, of unlawful entry and interference with a tenant. Lena said, "I'm sorry." Bergeron said it again more slowly. Fletcher owned 44 Rue des Pins. He had been, apparently, the building manager on record, and he was claiming that Lena had, on the morning of February 3rd, entered the building's private exterior stairwell without authorization, removed a tenant from the property, and coordinated with emergency services to have said tenant removed against the property owner's wishes. He was further claiming damages. He had attached photographs of the staircase and a letter from his lawyer. Lena was quiet for a long time. She was 83 years old, she said, in canvas slippers, at -19. "I know," Bergeron said. "She was going to get hypothermia." "I know," he said again. "He's saying I interfered." Bergeron told her that Canada Post Regional Office had received a formal legal notice and that pending review, she was being reassigned off Route 7 temporarily. He told her to keep the notice, to write down everything she remembered, to call him before she spoke to anyone. She sat in her car in the parking lot of the depot and looked at the steering wheel for a while. She thought about Dorothee saying 41 years in that simple way. She thought about the slippers. She thought about Fletcher Dowd filing paperwork on the same day she'd sat in the cold to make sure an old woman didn't lose her fingers. Then she called her sister. Her sister, Priya, was a paramedic, not the one from that morning. Priya worked a different district, but she knew people, and she had a particular response to injustice that involved her voice dropping very low and her sentences becoming very short. When Lena finished explaining, there was a silence on the phone. Then Priya said, "Where is she now, Dorothee?" "The hospital took her for observation. I don't know after that." "Find out," Priya said. Dorothee Gagnon had been a tenant in Unit 2C of 44 Rue des Pins for 11 years. She had been diagnosed with early to moderate vascular dementia the previous spring. Her only living relative, a nephew named Thierry who lived 40 minutes away in Rimouski, had power of attorney. When Lena found this out, through Bergeron, who had found it through a housing advocacy contact, she also found out something else. Thierry had recently begun the process of applying to have Dorothee move to a care facility. Not because the care facility was better for Dorothee, because Dorothee owned a small property in Saint-Pacôme, a cottage, mostly land, left to her by her husband Charles, and under the specific legal arrangement Thierry had constructed, guardianship over Dorothee would give him authority over that property. Fletcher Dowd had done Thierry a favor once. Nobody could say exactly what kind, but they knew each other, and it was Fletcher who had suggested, when the paramedics' report crossed certain desks, that the postal carrier had overstepped, that she'd disturbed a tenant who was simply getting air, that the emergency call had been premature and had caused Dorothee unnecessary distress, which was contributing to her confusion. He had said this, apparently, with a straight face. The complaint escalated. Canada Post's legal department got involved. There was talk, briefly, of a disciplinary review. Lena's route reassignment became indefinite. She was placed on a modified schedule. Depot sorting, no deliveries, which meant lower hours in a quiet, airless room where she sat next to a conveyor belt 8 hours a day. Bouchard stopped meeting her eyes in the hallway. The thing about being 26 and good at your job and treated like a problem is that there's a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in. Not the exhaustion of effort, but the exhaustion of being asked, over and over, to doubt what you know you saw. She had seen an old woman in slippers on a metal step at -19. She had sat with her. That was what she had done. And now there were lawyers. She didn't eat well. She slept in fragments. Priya called every other day, and Lena tried to sound steadier than she felt. She didn't know, at that point, that 3 people were already moving. The first was Dorothy herself. Dorothy had been discharged from hospital after 4 days to a short-term care suite in Rivière-du-Loup. She was on her clearer days, remarkably precise. She remembered Lena. She remembered the gloves appearing from somewhere unexpected. She remembered the parka around both their shoulders, and the sound of a pigeon on the roof and the warmth of another person in the cold. On one of her clear mornings, she told this to her occupational therapist, a young woman who happened to know Bergeron's housing advocacy contact. Things in small places have a way of connecting. The second was the paramedic who had handed Lena her parka back. His name was Rune. He had written, in the official call report, a description of what he'd found on arrival. One elderly female, inadequately dressed for conditions, showing early signs of hypothermia, being kept warm by a Canada Post carrier who had remained on scene. He had filed this report correctly and completely. When he heard, through the close channels of emergency services in a small city, that someone was claiming the postal carrier had interfered, Rune called the station supervisor and said, very quietly, that he would like to make his report available to whoever needed it. The third was a woman named Claudette Arsenault. Claudette was 67, and she had lived in 44 Rue des Pins for 9 years. She was in Unit 1B, ground floor, and she had watched Fletcher Dowd manage that building for almost a decade. She had kept notes. Not formal notes, a spiral notebook, dates and incidents, things she'd seen, things that had been reported to her by neighbors. The heat that cut out for 11 days in January 2022. The water damage in 3A that had never been properly repaired. The tenant in 2D who had withheld rent over a broken heating unit and received an eviction notice 48 hours later. Claudette had never done anything with the notebook because she hadn't known what to do with it. When she heard what was happening to the postal worker, heard it through the building, the way things travel in buildings, she went home, took the notebook off her shelf, and called the Régie du Logement. She also called a journalist, a small regional paper, nothing large. But the journalist had been looking for some months at a pattern of housing complaints across several Dowd properties, and hadn't been able to find anyone willing to speak on record. Claudette Arsenault was willing. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March, at the Canada Post regional office in a meeting room that smelled like old carpet and printer toner. It was not a courtroom, there was no judge, no gallery, but it had the same quality of a room where something would be decided. Lena sat on one side of a long table with Bergeron. Fletcher Dowd sat on the other side with his lawyer, a man in his 50s who kept clicking his pen. The pen clicking stopped when the door opened. Priya came in first. She was in her paramedic uniform. She had come directly from a shift, and she sat down in the chair along the wall without being asked. Behind her came Rune, in civilian clothes, carrying a folder. Behind him came Claudette Arsenault, small and upright, with a spiral notebook in her hands. And behind Claudette, in a wheelchair pushed by the occupational therapist, came Dorothy Gagnon. She was wearing a good coat. Her hair was neat. She had her hands folded in her lap, and when she came through the door, she looked across the table until she found Lena's face. There she is, Dorothy said, to no one in particular. That's the one who stayed. Fletcher Dowd's lawyer stopped clicking his pen. The hearing took 4 hours. Rune's report was entered. Claudette's notebook, which contained dated entries spanning 9 years, was entered. A statement from the hospital attending physician regarding Dorothy's condition on admission, core temperature, presentation, estimated time of outdoor exposure, was entered. The physician's note made specific reference to the warming intervention provided prior to paramedic arrival as a contributing factor to the outcome. Dorothy herself was asked by the reviewing officer whether she remembered the morning of February 3rd. She thought about it carefully. I was looking for Charles, she said, but he's been gone a while. I forget sometimes. She paused. The young woman sat with me. She put something warm around us. I remember that. She was asked if she had felt she was in danger. I was cold, Dorothy said, with the precision of someone who knew the difference between an answer and an explanation. I was very cold, and then I wasn't. Fletcher Dowd did not speak much. His lawyer spoke less as the hours went on. There is a certain kind of man who builds his position on the assumption that people won't organize, that they'll go home separately, stay quiet separately, decide separately that it isn't worth it. Fletcher had made that calculation about the tenants on Rue Cartier, about the man in 2D, about Claudette Arsenault for 9 years. He had made it about Lena Savoie. He had been wrong about all of them, but he had not known that until a woman in a wheelchair came through the door and said, "That's the one who stayed." The complaint against Lena was dismissed. Fully, the reviewing officer noted, in writing, that the carrier had acted appropriately under the circumstances, and that the formal complaint had been without substantive merit. She was restored to Route 7 effective the following Monday. Bouchard told her himself. He came to the sorting room and said, "You're back on route Monday." He said it like it was a routine update. Then he stood there a moment and said, "For what it's worth," and didn't finish the sentence. She figured she knew what he meant. The regional paper ran Claudette's story the following Tuesday. It was not a long piece, but it was specific. Dates, properties, patterns. Fletcher Dowd's name appeared in it 6 times. The Régie du Logement confirmed an open investigation. The cousin on the Municipal Housing Committee issued a statement saying he had not been in contact with Fletcher Dowd regarding any current matters, which was the kind of statement that made people wonder what the previous matters had been. Thierry's guardianship application was reviewed by a separate court, where Dorothy's physician testified about her condition and the distinction between needing support and needing to be managed. The cottage in Saint-Pacôme remained Dorothy's. A proper care arrangement was set up, one that Dorothy had a voice in, and that kept her close enough to Rivière-du-Loup that the occupational therapist could continue visiting. Lena went back to Route 7 on a Monday morning. The temperature was still cold, but the worst of February was behind them. She drove the route from the depot with the windows slightly down, the way she always did, because she liked the cold air when she was moving. She pulled up to 44 Rue des Pins at 8:51. The intercom had new labels on it. Someone had printed them and laminated them and pressed them into the slots beside each button. It was the kind of small thing that means someone has started paying attention. She left the mail in the box and walked back to the truck. There was a note tucked under her windshield wiper. She almost didn't take it. She'd never gotten notes on her truck before, but it was folded neatly, and her name was on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside it said, "Unit 1B, I make coffee at 9 most mornings. Knock if you want some. See Arsenault." Lena folded the note back along its crease and put it in her jacket pocket. She had 11 more stops before she could take a break. She drove toward them, thinking about how nothing that had happened in the last 6 weeks had been inevitable. Any part of it could have gone differently. She could have pressed the buttons and gotten no answer and left a form in the box and driven away. Rune could have filed a minimal report. Claudette could have left the notebook on the shelf. Dorothy could have had a worse morning. And Fletcher Dowd could have been a different kind of man. But he'd had decades to work on that, and he hadn't gotten around to it. The thing about staying, about sitting down on a cold step with a stranger and deciding that your route can wait, is that it looks, in the moment, like a small thing. It feels like a small thing. You're just sitting. You're just keeping someone warm. You don't know, when you take off your gloves, that Claudette Arsenault has a notebook. You don't know that a paramedic is going to write something down carefully enough that it survives 4 floors of bureaucracy and ends up mattering. You just know that the woman is cold and you are there and the gloves are on your hands. That is the whole of it, and it is also enough. I keep thinking about the gloves. Not the hearing, not the notebook, not the moment Dorothy came through the door in her good coat. The gloves. Lena took them off her own hands in -19 weather and put them on a stranger's, and she didn't think about it the way you think about a decision. She just did it, because the woman's hands were bare and hers weren't. That's the part that stays with me, because what Lena did that morning wasn't heroic in the way we usually mean that word. She didn't charge into anything. She sat down on a cold step and stayed, and that staying, That particular, unglamorous, route-delaying staying is what set everything else in motion. I think about the kind of integrity it takes to do the right thing when no one is watching and there's no obvious reward. Lena wasn't thinking about Claudette's notebook. She didn't know Rune would write his report the way he did. She had no reason to believe that any of it would matter beyond that morning. She just knew what she was looking at. And she knew what she had to do. That's a kind of moral clarity that doesn't come from following rules. It comes from somewhere quieter, from having decided at some point before the moment arrives what kind of person you intend to be. And then there's Claudette. 9 years of keeping notes in a spiral notebook that she didn't know what to do with. 9 years of watching, recording, waiting for the right moment without knowing when it would come or whether it would come at all. That takes a different kind of strength. The patience to hold on to what you know is true even when no one is asking you to produce it yet. The clarity to understand that evidence kept carefully is not the same as evidence wasted. She didn't give up on the notebook. She just kept it on the shelf until it was needed. And Rune, who wrote his report completely and correctly and made it available without being asked, who understood that the work of bearing witness doesn't end when you hand someone their coat back. What Fletcher counted on was the ordinary human tendency to go home and decide it isn't worth it, to let exhaustion and bureaucracy and the particular loneliness of being one person against a system do the work for him. He'd built his whole operation on that calculation, and it had worked for a long time because most people do go home. Most people do decide it isn't worth it, not because they're cowardly, because they're tired and they're alone, and the gap between what they know is right and what they have the capacity to prove feels too wide to cross. What none of them knew until that Thursday morning in March was that they weren't crossing it alone. That's the thing I come back to. Not that good always wins, because it doesn't, not reliably, not automatically, but that the people who do the right thing, quietly, correctly, without knowing who else is doing it at the same time, create conditions that make the right outcome possible. Lena stayed on the step. Rune wrote it down. Claudette kept her notebook. Dorothée remembered. None of them knew about the others, but it turned out they were all part of the same story. And Fletcher Dowd, who thought he was dealing with one postal worker, found out that he'd been dealing with all of them.